I'd like to take up a difficult subject tonight. At least it's difficult for me. The subject is pain and suffering, why things go wrong, and some approaches to what we can do about it. I can remember as a little kid wondering about it, because if God was all loving, then why was there pain and suffering? It didn't make sense to me. Even I can remember studying philosophy in college and not really getting an answer that satisfied me. So I've wondered about it for a long time. It was a great shock to me to realize one day that pain, suffering, negativity, mistakes, things that don't go right will always be in my life. And that no matter how much I might get transformed, or however much I might grow, however much I might work on myself, there are still going to be those elements in my life of pain, suffering, things that go wrong, negativity, whatever name you want to give it. And that in fact, my life would look like this. I could actually predict it. Pain, followed by pleasure, followed by pain, followed by pleasure, followed by pain. On and on and on. There's a saying in the markets that if you take care of the losers, the winners will take care of themselves. That seems to be true in our own lives, because when things are going well for us in any particular area, we don't usually sit around and analyze it. We don't usually say, gosh, do I really deserve this? We just enjoy it. It's when things go wrong that we wonder, gee, what's happening here? Why is this happening? And where we're challenged to come up with a more skillful response. A number of people have talked about archetypes. Carl Jung started with that, and he's been followed by many others, including Carol Pearson and others. And so to sort of approach this subject, I'd like to use this concept of archetypes at first, and start out with an archetype which can be called the innocent. And that's what we all start out as. We all start out as innocents. Think of a small baby. It's got no concepts, it's got no beliefs, it's got no attitudes, it's got no agendas, it's got no axes to grind. It's not making any distinctions, and so it's unified with all of life, in a sense. But it hasn't experienced the world yet either. And so sooner or later, and usually sooner, what happens is that we fall from grace, have to leave the Garden of Eden, so to speak, and we discover that there's pain in the world, and that we can be hurt, and that God might be dead, and that the government is not always benevolent, and that people can sometimes be unloving toward us, and on and on and on. We discover all these things about the world, and so then we become an archetype that can be described as the orphan. And the orphan is experiencing this pain, suffering, disillusionment with finding out that the world is not as he or she thought. This fall from grace. And sooner or later, that pain becomes great enough that we start on a journey of some kind. We start on a journey to try to get some answers of how to approach life, how to deal with life, and in particular, its negative aspects. The first approach might be called the approach of the wanderer. If we think about how we deal, we can call negativity dragons. Okay, how we deal with the dragons of life. In that first approach, the wanderer basically says, I'm out of here. I can't deal with this. This is too much for me. Often, stories of cowboys, knights, travelers on a journey, all of that represents the archetype of the wanderer, somebody who is on a journey to try to find out something new about who they are and about how they want to approach life. The downside of the wanderer is that it can be a very solitary journey. We can become somewhat cut off from community, love and warmth and community. On the other hand, the wanderer is basically making the statement that life is not fundamentally suffering, but life is fundamentally an adventure. It's a journey, it's an adventure. We're going to find out something. So basically the wanderer is fleeing from the dragon. In fact, often in fairy tales, they start out with the hero or the heroine trapped in some way, trapped in a castle, trapped by an evil spell, trapped in a dungeon, and escaping. Another way of dealing with dragons is an archetype that can be called the warrior. And the warrior says, I'm not going to flee this dragon. I'm going to stay here and stand my ground and fight. And the warrior archetype is the most basic archetype of our society. When we think of a hero, we usually think of somebody battling evil, battling the bad people to bring about some good result. And that can be a very good thing, the idea of learning to stand our ground, take a position, and defend it. The downside is that the warrior lives in a world of black and white. You're either with us or you're against us. It's us versus them thinking. It's tribal thinking. It's the idea that I'm going to love my group, my nation, my tribe, my denomination, my whatever we're identified with. But others are often seen as outsiders, people that we should reject or at least stay away from. So like all archetypes, the warrior has a limitation, and it also has something good about it, something that we can learn from. A third archetype might be called the archetype of the lover. And the lover is learning to continue to care in the face of hardship, difficulties, obstacles, dragons, whatever. Learning to continue to put caring out there. The downside of it can be that the lover can become a martyr if this caring becomes too sacrificial. If the feeling of it becomes, I'm doing this sacrifice for something or other. The martyr will sometimes give up parts of themselves for the greater cause, for whatever the cause happens to be. The upside of it is that the lover learns that putting out that love does not necessarily depend upon external conditions. The fourth kind of archetype we could call the magician. A magician says basically, I'm going to play with this dragon. I'm going to find a way to use this energy. For instance, that's the position of an Aikido master. An Aikido master does not see himself or herself in opposition to the opponent. Rather, if the opponent makes an aggressive movement of some kind, the Aikido master is looking for some way to simply use that energy. And the first thing they do is they align with it somehow. In fact, in many of the Aikido positions, they actually physically line up in the same direction as the attacker, so that they're actually facing in the same direction, and then they find some way to use the energy. Another example of a magical approach would be the Grateful Dead and how they dealt with the problem of unauthorized taping of their concerts. This was quite a persistent problem for them, that people would just bring recorders and do all these unauthorized tapings. So what they did was, they set up a special section right in the center, placed beautifully for taping. They charged a lot of extra money for it. but you get really, really good recordings. At every concert, you'll find a couple hundred people in there in this special section taping the concert. So that's a way of taking something that was potentially negative and finding a way to constructively use it, which is characteristic of the magical approach. Another example might be the city of Amsterdam. I vividly remember it was December of 1983. I was driving down a street in Paris at night, and I saw these streetwalkers, prostitutes, on the corners of the streets, and it was bitterly cold. It was like 5 degrees. They were standing out in the cold. They were very cold. The next day, I was in Amsterdam, and the women were all behind glass windows. They were inside, they were listening to music, they were comfortable, and above all, they were warm. And obviously, the city officials of Amsterdam had said something like, look, this is going to go on, has always gone on in human history for as long as we know of, goes on in every city of the world, and is going to go on here, regardless of whether we pass laws outlawing it or whatever. So, why don't we license it, make it legal, bring it inside, in the process have health inspections and things so that everybody involved there's going to be a lot less sexually transmitted disease. And, when it's cold outside, they're not going to be out there shivering in the cold. They did a very similar approach with certain drugs such as marijuana. They decriminalized it, they regulated it within certain limits. People can do what they want. What's the result? Amsterdam has the lowest crime statistics of any major city in Europe. That's another example of a magical approach, of taking something that is a negative energy or a potentially negative energy and finding a way to constructively, to align with the energy somehow and constructively use it. The potential downside of the magical approach is that it's not necessarily a healing approach. For instance, in the movie The Lover, which played in Raleigh recently, there's a Chinese man, the protagonist, who takes his lover and her mother and her 2 brothers out to dinner one night. In the course of the night, the older brother gets very, very drunk, and at one point smashes a glass and walks up to the Chinese man and says, if you want to fight, it would take 2 of you to defeat me. He says this in a very menacing tone. And the protagonist says, oh no, it would take at least 4 of me to defeat you. You have no idea how truly weak I am. Which did indeed diffuse the situation momentarily. It was a magical approach, but it was not a healing approach. To see what a truly healing approach might be, let's talk about an archetype which we could call the healer. I've come to prefer the term the healer because at some level we're all trying to heal ourselves. And in some way, we're all trying to heal the world and make a difference. Maybe just in our little corner of it, but we're all trying to heal ourselves and in some way heal the world. The story is about George Doxey. He was a little boy living in Hungary, I believe it was, sometime in the 30s or 40s. The Soviet Union had started a pogrom against Jews, and Jews were fleeing across the border into Hungary to escape this persecution. George's grandfather went down to the railroad station and picked up many of these people and brought them home. Imagine the scene. They're crowding, there's women and children and men crowding the living room, crowding the dining room. And the little boy, above all, loved his meals. The little boy was quite unhappy with this whole scene because dinner was being held up, and so he threw a fit. And he started screaming and stamping his feet and saying, I want my dinner, I want my dinner. And the maid offered him some bread. And he took the bread, the crust of bread, and he threw it on the floor, and he said, "I want my dinner." At that point, his grandfather walked in, heard this, saw this. His grandfather bent down, picked up the crust of bread, kissed it, and handed it to the boy, who ate it. Think about that for a minute. Many of us would have said, something like, "You pick that up right now. Think about all the starving people in, somewhere or other." Instead, it was a gesture of humility, healing, true love, great authority. It was a healing gesture. The thing about healing is that it kind of reverses the usual way of approaching things. What we usually do is we divide the world into good and bad in some way. Things that we like, people who like us, people we don't like, things we don't like, situations we don't like. And we try to get more of what we like and to push away what we don't like. It was quite a realization for me one day to realize that light and darkness always go together, and have to. They're actually woven together. Imagine for a minute walking out in the sun. If you're in the sun, you have to cast a shadow. There is no choice about it. If you're in the light, you're also casting a shadow. And interestingly enough, the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. But that also tells us something else. Where we find a shadow, we know that nearby there's also a light. And the deeper the shadow, the greater the potential light that is there. If we can discover it, nurture it, bring it out. What that basically involves is, I guess to really approach this, we'll have to go to the master healer, which is Jesus. And let's see what Jesus said about healing. What he said I find very interesting. He said, I'll put this in modern day terms, paraphrasing a little. He said, if we love only those who love us, and we're only good to those people who are good to us, what credit is that to us? Anybody can do that. That's what everybody does. He said, if we really want to open up our hearts, we have to learn to love the unlovable. We have to learn to accept the unacceptable, the unwanted. That's where it really happens or it doesn't. There's a beautiful metaphorical story about it, the story of Beauty and the Beast. To retell the story a little bit, Beauty, through a series of adventures, finds herself at the Beast's castle, is basically repelled by the Beast, but they have dinner every night, and gradually over a period of time, Beauty learns that the Beast has a soul. So she can accept him partially, but not completely. At one point in the story, she goes back to her regular home with her father, and the Beast languishes and gets nearer and nearer to death. Finally, Beauty has a dream in which she sees what's happening to the Beast, goes back to the Beast, and says, I'll marry you. At which point, the Beast turns into the prince that he really is. It's a great metaphor for what we're talking about here, that when we can love those parts of the world that are unlovable, Jesus said, love your enemies. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who despise you. Very puzzling words, very puzzling. I believe what he was really talking about was trying to embrace it all, trying to come to an opening of the heart where even those parts of the world that seem unlovable can be loved. Now, let's think about that for a moment. Does that mean that we should, as Robert Bly says, does that mean that we should let everybody out of jail? Does that mean we should go back with our ex-spouse? Does that mean we should go back to our old job? No, not necessarily. We may need to set up appropriate boundaries. It simply means that we don't put anybody out of our heart. We don't put anything out of our heart. And we look for creative solutions that can incorporate the negativity in some way. Every negativity is bearing a gift for us. It's bearing a message. Let's take a simple example to see what that means. Suppose that our shoe is too tight. So we're feeling pain in our shoe, and for a while we do our best to ignore it. We've got other things to do. But after a while the pain gets too great. The pain is actually simply a message to us. When we look at that message, we might do whatever we do. Perhaps we'll change our shoes. But also we might reorient toward the future, because from then on when we go to buy shoes, we're probably going to be more careful about the size of the shoe we buy. So in essence, that pain message had the potential to actually improve the overall long-term happiness of our life. So it seems to me that the elements of that, if we break it down, are the first thing we do about any sort of pain, negativity, suffering, is that we look at it with a certain amount of grace and equanimity. In other words, we try to look at it with a clear eye without applying the aversive energy right away. Quite often, for instance, if we have a pain in our body, our first response to it is aversion. Go away. Go away. That's often our first response to any sort of pain or negativity or suffering. Go away. It's aversion. So the first step is to look at it without that aversive energy, to simply look at it with a certain amount of balance. Then the second step would be to find the message or find the positive seed that exists within the negativity. Somewhere in that negativity is a positive seed. And if we can locate that seed and begin to water that seed, we can often create something good out of that negativity. A couple of examples are, one time I was working for a computer company, and this one fellow really didn't like me, and I didn't like him. And so the two of us were, just having a horrible time of it with each other. I was very good at seeing all of his flaws, and he was very good at seeing all of my flaws, and things were just going downhill fast. I remember going home one night and just thinking, well, let's try something new here. So I asked myself if there was anything good about him. I took out a sheet of paper and I was going to write down 10 good things about him. And I remember I sat there and I couldn't think of anything. There was nothing. And then finally, one tiny little thing came. And then another and another, and I wrote down a list of about 10 things that I could appreciate about him. And I found that as I focused on those things, I gradually came to view him in a different light. And gradually that would come out of me, in comments out of my mouth. This change that was going on inside, internally, started coming out in various ways. And to make the story short, we became quite good friends after a while. That was perhaps my first experience of trying to find the positive seed within the negativity and water it in some way to bring about a better result. Another example is there's a wonderful children's story called Jerome the Frog. And Jerome is this frog. He wants to be a knight, but everybody thinks that's ridiculous because he's, after all, just a frog. But, just to humor him, the town sends him out on several little missions, and he accomplishes these quite well. So then they decide, well, what the heck, let's send him out on the big one, because there's this dragon that's been breathing fire and burning villages. So they send Jerome out to slay the dragon. Jerome buckles on his sword. The dragon says, wait a minute, why are you going to try to slay me? The dragon says, breathing fire is my nature. I can't help it. That's my nature, to breathe fire. Jerome ponders this. And they discuss it. And finally they come up with a solution that the dragon will burn the town garbage on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The interesting part about that is it's a victimless kind of problem solving. In effect, what Jerome managed to do was to find the positive seed within that negativity and water it in some way. Yes, the dragon breathes fire, but maybe that could be constructively used somehow. And the most important part of it was that in any sort of healing process, what is looked upon previously as negative is incorporated, is brought into a larger whole. Nothing is left out. That was what Jesus was always talking about. Love your enemies, do good to those that hate. What he was basically saying was, nothing is left out. Nothing is left out. Everything's included. I'd like to finish up with a little story about a Zen monk that was meditating for many decades and unfortunately could not reach enlightenment. So he's getting very old, and he decided to go up into the mountains to die. So he left his monastery and he was walking up the path toward the top of the mountain where he was going to die. And he saw coming down the path this old person who seemed to have a certain peace or radiance about them. And he wondered, God, he just seems like an old fool, but maybe I'll ask him anyway. He stopped him and he said, oh, and by the way, the old man coming down the mountain was carrying this great big bundle on his back. And he stopped him and he said, by the way, do you know anything about this thing called awakening? In reply, the old man simply took his huge bundle on his back and let it drop to the ground. And the monk understood. And he dropped all of his judgments, all of his condemnations, all of his polarizations, all of his dualities. And enraptured in liberation, he cried out, just this, just this. And at that point, the old man said, oh, I forgot, one more thing. Picked up the bundle once more, pointed toward the village, and walked off down the road. And then there's a story after the story. And this is a true story. I always like true stories. There was a Zen master one night, and a monk came in for an interview with the Zen master. And after they talked for a while, it had gotten dark. The master said, would you like a lantern to walk home with? And the monk said, yes, thank you. So the master gave him the lantern, and just as the monk was walking out the door, the master blew out the light. Very puzzling. What could this mean? Maybe the master was saying that we can't make our journey on borrowed light, that we need to develop our own internal light. And all the things we do to welcome up the shadow part of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that are repressed away, that are unwanted, that don't fit our self-image, we can welcome up into consciousness. When we feel something negative, our impulse is usually either to repress it or act it out in some way. Instead, we can honor it by looking at it, feeling it, respecting it, loving it. Gradually, it starts to integrate into consciousness. It rejoins consciousness. Instead of being sealed off somewhere, it integrates into our consciousness. And often this is true of the external world too. In fact, by definition, we don't see what's in our shadow very well, the things that we've repressed. If we want a clue as to what's in our shadow, all we have to do is look out into the external world and see what hooks us. What is it that we dislike? What kind of qualities or traits in people hook us in the sense that we don't like them, we don't like that kind of person? That's a clue that that same quality is in us. Otherwise, it wouldn't hook us. We would just say, oh, that's interesting, but it wouldn't hook us emotionally. So the basic idea is to take these things that seem unwanted, unworthy, negative, unlovable, whatever, whether internally or externally, and see if we can apply enough love and forgiveness and compassion toward them, and in the process gradually transform ourselves as well.